What's going on, everybody, and welcome to Event Marketing Redefined. I am your host, Matt Kleinrock, CEO of Rockaway Exhibits and Events. And today I have an awesome show, and we are going to talk experiential today. And I have Kamil Tyebally with me who is the founder of Early Spring, which is an experiential agency. And him and I are going to be talking a little bit about what I would consider behind the curtain of experiential, which is the research and strategy side. Kamil, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here. How's it going?
It's going good, man. It's going good. I'm excited to talk about this topic because I think that experiential really is like a buzzword a lot of times, and people don't really understand all that goes into it. It just gets thrown around all over the place for events, pop-ups, trade shows, anything in the brand space. Everybody loves talking about it. But when you and I spoke, I really loved some of the stuff you were talking about, work you had done, and sort of the in-depth nature of the backside of what creates what people get to experience, right? So my big thing with experiential that, we talk about in my company is like, I always try to relate it to one simple thing, which is that when you go through experiences with people in your life, just on a very basic level, whatever it may be, a great night out partying, right? Or a trip, something tragic, it does not matter what it is. But when you go through experiences with people, it forges these bonds and this connection is what I would say. And I think when I say that to people, I hope that they feel sort of it is what I feel, which is like, oh yeah, for sure. Like I recognize that. So I think what's interesting is creating experiential events. It's like when you do create an experience and you do nail it, that is what you are creating and what you are developing for your consumers, your customer, your audience, whoever it may be. So just excited to kind of talk about how you are, as you say at Early Spring, engineering serendipity, which is a really cool saying.
Yeah. Matt, I think what you've done is basically describe serendipity, right? You're at a party and it just feels right. You're with the right people in the right place. The music is just right.
It's like a moment.
And
yeah.
It's a moment, right? And really, if we think about serendipity, it is finding, value in and delight in the things that you weren't necessarily looking for, but when they happen, you just realize that you've needed this all along. Right? So the whole thesis around Early Spring is if you do the work behind the scenes, you can give those moments the best chance of coming to life, right? You can really sort of create those moments. I think where a lot of what we see within experiential, tends to revolve around pretty looking spaces that have, different sort of interactive touch points and what have you, need to have a reason to be there. They need to be strategically thought out as opposed to leading with like, I want a ball pit. This is going to make my customers happy, and let's just do that. And, we'll get it.
Well, there's just a lot of work that goes behind the curtain, right? Why don't you give us a little bit of your background? Because you have an interesting background that kind of got you here, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the photography. I want to hear a little bit about Fake Love, because obviously they were big in sort of immersive tech experiences. And tell me kind of how you got here of being a founder of Early Spring and this idea of engineering serendipity for experiential sort of agency events.
Sure. So, I grew up in Asia. I'm from Singapore. I came here to New York about 15 years ago to study photography. Growing up, I was certainly not academically inclined. And I heard someone say once, if you sort of gather experience, then, it gives you sort of a good chance of making it in the world, essentially. And that idea stuck with me. And I just dove really deep into experiences and experiencing things. And photography felt like a great sort of vessel to experience, various different things. So my interest was in documentary photography, and I traveled to Iraq and, sort of all around the Middle East, to Burma, all these different places, taking photographs, but also really getting an understanding of people and talking to individuals, learning their stories. For whatever reason, photography didn't quite pan out, but I, wound up working in advertising, and I came across this agency, Fake Love, who I thought at the time were just doing really incredible, thoughtful, amazing things using sort of technology, blending it with art, and creating beautiful immersive experiences. And for about a year, I hounded them for a job, and eventually I was hired. And
Nice. I love that. I love that part.
and it was incredible, right? Like the amount of thought that went into the types of experiences that they were building, very much focused on creating immersive narratives, I thought was incredible. From there, I moved on to Refinery 29, and I was part of the team that built 29 Rooms. And 29 Rooms sort of became a thing on its own, right? 29 Rooms it is exactly what it sounds like, right? We took over an 80,000 square foot warehouse and built out 29 different branded experiences. Now, you got to remember that this came from Refinery 29, which was a mission-driven women's media platform, and each of the rooms was sort of a manifestation of different editorial tentpoles that we'd be writing about. So, you have rooms about body positivity or gender equality, bullying, the environment, and get about 40,000 people walking through the space over the course of the weekend. And when we started this, you could really sense that people felt like they'd found their place, that things that they were feeling inside were expressed in a physical space that essentially makes them feel seen and heard and understood. And
it resonates, right?
It resonates, right? And
when
it resonates, they want to talk about it, they want to share it. And I think that's primarily what drove 29 Rooms to its virality, right? Like it reached 1 billion people on Instagram at one point. I think a couple years into it, a lot of brands were seeing this virality and were looking to kind of replicate that, but doing so led primarily by what the sort of visual outcome was, right? Like bright colors, ball pits, interaction. And I felt that there was less of a focus on what actually made 29 Rooms as successful as it was. And that was sort of the, genesis of Early Spring, right? Like I felt like Experiential really needed to be approached in a very thoughtful, nuanced way. Experiences are so different from a print ad or a TV commercial, right? Like the expectation is that you're asking your consumer to come into your space and spend time with the brand, but they're not really going to like switch the channel and move on to something else.
Yeah.
And I think that's deserving of a certain amount of respect, and you sort of need to acknowledge their intelligence. These are smart people that are walking through your space. It's not enough to just sort of sell them on whatever it is that you're selling. I think it's more about creating a value exchange that goes beyond just a transaction.
I like the value exchange thing that you said a lot, because I think that to me just screams like authenticity. It's like it feels authentic. Things that don't feel authentic, you kind of just know it. You know what I mean? Whether you're in a conversation that's not, or, just an experience that seems very manufactured. Yeah, that's the kind of how I view that, with what you're saying. It feels like when something feels authentic, it just feels right.
Exactly. I think there's so many different ways for a brand to sell a product to a person, right? Like, I mean, e-commerce is obviously, blown that up. I think what a physical experience enables a brand to do is kind of move beyond that and to create a real sort of back and forth relationship with your customer. It's a space for you to transmit your values, what you stand for. It's kind of like going to somebody's house for the first time, right? And like you learn so much about them. You need to feel comfortable in the space.
I like the example of going to a person's house for the first time. That's really good. It makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about like a lot of what you are doing, and a lot of what I find fascinating is what we would consider like research strategy side of experiential. Because again, like I said in the beginning, people throw out experiential like, oh, let's make it experiential. And it's like, people don't fully understand what that really means. So I think there's obviously levels to this, right? There is very complex things that get created. Obviously, they take research, they take strategy. There's also very simple things that if you know your customer and you're in tune with your audience, you can create that experience for them pretty simply. Give me just a little bit of information, for people listening and marketers themselves in terms of like, what is the research strategy side? How does that come together? What exactly are you doing when you're trying to create an event, create an experience, a moment? What does the research and strategy look like?
So very basic level, it starts with asking a lot of whys,
Mm-hmm.
to really understand what is motivating the marketeer to want to, do something experientially. And that can be, all manner of things. Like, are we trying to drive awareness for a new product? Is this a pop-up retail space where we actually want to push product? Just figuring out, what the goals of the space really are. The sort of end goal is to build some sort of narrative-driven experience. Figuring out what that narrative is sort of where the strategy comes in, right? So to be honest, it's not necessarily complicated. I think it's more sort of the method to doing it. But it starts off with generating different hypotheses and finding data and insight to support what your hypothesis is, right?
Yeah.
So these hypotheses are based on experience, on observation, things that you're seeing out in the world, what is sort of trending. So, once you kind of build a good case for that hypothesis, what you can start to do is write a story around what a space is going to be. Again, like depending on what the function of the experience is, those stories tend to change and differ. But once you have that basic sort of creative platform or that narrative in place, then you start designing based off of that.
So I love what you said about narrative, right? A narrative driven experience. And it's sort of, to me, with the end goal, it's sort of like you're kind of reverse engineering this, right? In terms of you're trying to understand what is this narrative? What is the end goal? And then, you're kind of beginning with the end in mind, right? As you start to build this out. And one thing that I tell people all the time is like, in terms of retail, retail does a very good job of giving you an experience when you walk in. Like they understand what your experience is going to be like. I think a lot of times events, trade shows in particular, what we do, people do a very poor job. They're not thinking about that. They're just thinking about selling their product versus saying, okay, how do I want someone to feel? Maybe how do I want them to move? What do I want them to see first? What senses am I going to get working? But I love what you're saying about a narrative driven experience and creating that.
I think what you just said around how you want people to feel is what the narrative needs to accomplish, right?
Yeah. What is that?
Exactly, right? So a narrative is basically the sort of string that binds all of your different touch points together. It gives the space a purpose, and it informs what all of your different sort of activations or touch points can be. And I'm talking specifically within the context of a trade show or a retail space. But again, I think different types of experiences require different types of narratives as well, right?
And then what do you think about, we talked a little bit about like audience, like these things that get mixed in, right? That you have to research, that you have to consider, that are very specifics. We talk with our customers running, for trade shows and events about like, hey, like how well do you know your audience? How well do you know sort of what they're looking for, why they're there? But you and I discussed audience, culture. What does a brand have permission to do? These things you're kind of, making sure you're building a foundation to then go create ideas and, map this together. So talk a little bit about those, why they're important and kind of, I guess your thoughts on them.
Yeah. So, I think of strategic foundation as a triangulation of those three different aspects, right? Like, who is your audience and what do they care about? What are they looking at? What do they share? What do they have in common that we can really leverage? We look at culture, what are the different movements within culture that we can tap into? What are the narratives in the world that we can sort of tap into? And what that really allows you to do is drive kind of the relevance of the brand, right? Like that you are, you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening culturally, right? Like we don't want a brand to be dated or feel irrelevant.
Yes.
And I think once you have those, you can look at, sort of the value structure of a brand and figure out where it makes sense and where they really have permission to operate. And that's how you kind of weave those pieces together. So you don't really, you're not doing anything kind of essentially off-brand or distasteful or that people just wouldn't get. I think having a very clear sort of understanding of those three factors and how they all come together perfectly is really important.
I like the triangle thought, right? And I love what you're saying about culture. To me, culture, when it's nailed right, when you tie it in, to me, it builds a connection. It builds this affinity, something you relate to right away, but it makes me think one of our biggest customers is a big brand in the Southeast. They are a grocery store chain, right? And essentially they stay very on brand, like we've tried to push them around like outside the box a little bit at times, but I love how committed they are to who they are. And then they find the cultural aspects and pieces that fit with who they are to the customer. And it's just so consistent, so on point, and they mix it into everything that they do, which I really, really love. Now their audience is used to that. Their audience can spot that. The audience can feel that. And having that understanding, I think really helps them at scale build, people say they want brand affinity, brand awareness, that's kind of it.
I think that's really interesting because, it sounds like what you're talking about is finding kind of nuance within a larger cultural, movement, right? Like I think about a relationship with a friend, someone who I find interesting. And what makes that person interesting is they have a perspective on what's happening within the culture, right? Like the most boring people in the world regurgitate everything that
have no opinion.
Hear,
they have no opinion.
No opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it is a little scary to have an opinion, but I think if you look at the most successful brands, they always have a perspective and a point of view. And even if everyone doesn't agree with it, it's interesting.
It's theirs
you want to
as well.
lean in, you want to hear it. Exactly. It's ownable. I think that's really important to try and carve out within the context of experiential, just as much as it is, within any other sort of communication platform, right? Like whether it's a TV commercial or a print ad. Experiential really allows you to lean more heavily into what your perspective is.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about audience, right? Because I know like trying to relate this back to me in terms of, my mind, the way I think, which is like, we are always pressing on our customers, like, who is your audience? Who is your customer? Who are they really? Don't tell me they are a PR rep for an age, give me more, go deeper. We want to understand them so that when we're creating experience, do they want to feel? Do they want to touch? Do they want, you know what I mean? You have to, I feel like the more you understand your customer, the better experience you can create from either an elementary or a super complex way. So give me a little bit on, if you were an event marketer or just a marketer working at a company brand and you're fairly new, right? Like what's some advice you would give them about either researching their audience or trying to understand their audience deeper so that they can create better experiences for them?
I think obviously this varies from brand to brand, right? Like we're ultimately going to have a different sort of target demographic. I think for us, where our there's sort of two areas where the focus really lies. I'm a strong believer in like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think having an acknowledgement of that, right? Like especially the top three rungs, thinking about love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization as being really drivers of sort of the human spirit, right? I think that stuff sometimes gets sidelined in place of more sort of stereotypical archetypes, right? Like,
it's a male, he's 50s, in his 50s.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. I know exactly what
jet
you're saying.
skis on the weekends and wears camo and goes duck hunting, right? Like, sure, stuff's amazing and it can be useful, but sometimes I think it's important to take a step back. I also, think back to, you could look at sort of the Jungian archetypes, 12 traditional archetypes. I think that covers so much ground. And, even looking at things through that perspective, these are kind of factors that cross sort of geographies or age or, life stage, so many different things. And I think using that to inform direction, that particular group of people as it relates to the brand would really care about is a nice way to frame your mind around, what you should be doing for your audience.
I love what you said about Maslow's hierarchy, right? And bringing that into the picture. Like, because it is saying like, hey, okay, everybody can put a customer persona together, which is what you're saying. That's the Manila, that's the top. But essentially, when you're trying to build an experience and you have to understand them further, the one thing you said, with Maslow's hierarchy that, got me thinking is, okay, love and belonging. And belonging, everybody wants to belong to something. People want to be a part of something. So then that belonging takes me to community. So is your audience, are they a community? B2C, I think it's easy to find community and belonging for the same group of people. Like if you like Apple products, right? Okay, that's easy. But in B2B, I think is way more challenging, but it's there. You just have to go find it. Meaning, say B2B and B2C being different, which they are, but it's still people. B2B is still people like B2C. So what kind of community are they in? What kind of sense of belonging do they want to feel to with their interests and things of that nature? So I love what you're saying about going deeper to understand your audience inside of Maslow's hierarchy, or just thinking, like you said, thinking in that space to get outside of the normal persona driven. He's a male, he's 50, he's been in the company for 10 years, he likes that. I mean, I love that thought for marketers. I think it's a great thought.
I think once you sort of dig a little deeper into your traditional persona, right? Like there's this Harvard professor, I think his name's Gerald Slotman, and he has this theory that 95% of the purchase decisions that we make are made in the unconscious mind, right? And that is the biggest part of that is emotion, right? And there's no doubt that like having an emotional sensibility is something that, whether you're a direct to consumer, consumer, if you're a B2C consumer or you're a B2B consumer, you're going to have that. You're going to want to feel something, right? You're going to want to feel good about the purchase decision that you're making. And I think that, it's really important to acknowledge that and figure out how to, essentially enchant someone around your brand. How do you sort of build that innate kind of desire to want to belong and be associated with a brand?
Yep. So what you saying about the purchase decisions being made in the unconscious, right? And then essentially saying, okay, that leads to emotion. Well, that kind of gets me thinking of all the sales reading I've done and, all these things in sales. And sales basically said that like, they buy from people that they like, right? So you have to be likable. You have to mirror people. Those are all tactics. Those are just little tactics, but understanding that people do buy on emotion. People are not buying objectively all the time. They're buying based on emotion because people are emotional creatures. We're all emotional to some degree. And I think a lot of what we're talking about in marketing and engineering serendipity, creating experiences and putting people in these moments at events together is creating a connection, creating belonging. And if you can do that as a brand, it takes what you are doing, what companies are doing, research, strategy, ideas, asking yourself about your audience, asking yourself, what is my why? What is our purpose for doing this, right? Beginning with the end in mind. It's like some people think a lot of this stuff is fluff, and it's not. It's just great stuff when you do it. When you do it right, when you think about it. I even encourage our customers. I'm like, hey, I don't even care if you swing and miss the first time. Let's try at least and ask your customer, hey, did we miss on this? Like, are we way off? Like, why didn't this hit with you? But eventually you'll figure it out. Eventually you'll get that connection. You'll build something with them where they're like, oh shit, that was great. And that's what I love about that.
One of my favorite things about working in experiential is walking through a space and listening to people talk about it, just hearing their, sort of unfiltered opinions. I mean, think about 29 rooms. This is a space with thousands of people. No one knows that, I was behind anything.
You're just listening
and they'll talk, just listening in, even like talking to people, engaging with them. I think getting that feedback, it informs so much of how to optimize for future, activations. There's nothing better than getting, feedback from the people that you're trying to connect with. That piece it's sort of the best litmus test for how successful you're being within a space, right? Yeah, super important.
The people.
Sometimes people, sometimes people
That's-
hate it. They're like,
yeah,
this is really
which is
stupid. And
okay.
like,
Which is
that's
okay.
fine. Yeah.
Yep. I like that. I like the idea of listening to people, right? I like the idea of understanding the space, observing the space. We do a lot of that with our clients as well in things that aren't as experiential as maybe big experiences that took a year to put together, right? Or things of that nature. But we are watching in trade show exhibits, we are watching at events, so that the next time we go back to recreate it, we're like, okay, at least even just watching people's traffic patterns, where they go, where they don't go, what they avoid, what they gravitate to. These are all things where you can get better every single year, every single event. And I think for event marketers and marketers, like, that advice is something that you have to implement right away. You got to be watching your events. You got to be noticing people, listening. You got to do a little eavesdropping, a little bit of listening, right? So that you can constantly tweak. Kamil, give me one of your favorite, say, experiences that you created.
Sure. So pre-pandemic, we had an RFP from Bumble dating app. They have a function called Bumble Biz that, is essentially a networking functionality of the app. And they wanted to activate a symposium in Atlanta. They had Serena Williams, who's their, sort of global ambassador, available on a certain date. She was going to be the keynote speaker. And, to be honest, that was kind of the long and the short of the brief. It was, how do we engage underrepresented entrepreneurs in Atlanta with, Serena Williams as the keynote speaker. And I thought this was a fascinating brief, not in the least because I was underrepresented entrepreneur. I suppose it just started, the agency. And what we did was we started to really dig into what it was like to start a business in the state of Georgia and cover all matter of sort of
that's that research,
right?
That's that research that you're talking about. Yeah.
We're looking at what sort of graduates are coming out of universities in Georgia, what sort of policy there is around starting a business. We wanted to find what the challenges were essentially, right? And figure out how to kind of address them.
So just to interrupt you real quick on that, the challenges and the research that you're doing, I think it ties back so perfectly to what we were saying. Business owners, entrepreneurs, starting a business, you are just finding sense of belonging. Right there. That's what you're finding, because they all share those common pain points. They share all that common journey together. I love it. Keep going. Sorry.
Exactly. So, it's about figuring out what those pain points are. And, it boiled down to three things that kept on kind of coming up for us. And one of them was finance, right? How do I raise money? And really, what do I do with that money once I've got it? How do I use it wisely? Second one was mentorship. How do I find a mentor and how do I inculcate a mutually beneficial relationship with that mentor? And the third one was community. How do I find other people that are going through the same sort of emotional, turmoil that I'm going through day in and day out? Where you're super thrilled one day and the next day you want to shut it all down and hide in your bed. Again, I think we were really well situated to work on this because we were going through the same things. And a bit of a side note, I think I have this very firm belief that the spirit of an experience is always channeled through the people that create it, right? Have the people that you're trying to talk to reflected in the people that are creating that experience for them, right? No one knows them better. No one has the instinct for that audience better. And we developed this entire schedule of programming that either addressed one or all of these pain points, from workshops to, keynotes, presentations. Everything had to sort of pair back to providing or addressing one of these pain points. And, it also informs design, right? Like, how do you create a space that allows for community? The space that we ended up building, had to be modular. We had to have people be able to move things around when they wanted to have a one-on-one conversation versus a group conversation versus, everyone sort of facing one direction and listening to a keynote. I gotta say, Matt, design-wise, probably not anything groundbreaking here. Very clear sort of brand guidelines from Bumble. I think it was really intelligently designed, but there was a particular moment that, really sort of stood out to me. And during one of these presentations, and, to preface, this is a probably 85% female crowd. I would say probably 90% Black. This young guy stands up puts his hand up. He's like, I have a question. And he goes, in front of the entire group. As a Black man, I really struggle to ask for help when I need it, because I feel like I need to project this image that, I have my shit together, that,
Yeah.
I know what
It's
I'm
a tough
doing.
thing to say in a room full of people. Wow.
It is an incredibly vulnerable moment.
Yeah, it's very vulnerable.
For someone to like stand up and just like,
Yeah.
say something like that. And I mean, the audience was kind of gobsmacked. Certainly the speaker didn't really know how to respond. And in that moment, this other guy stands up and he goes, hey, listen, like I totally hear what you're saying. I feel exactly the same way. Let's, I'll give you my number, and anytime you need to talk to anyone, call me and we'll figure it out. And, let's not kid ourselves, right? Like we're slinging app downloads, but for a moment like that to happen, it's so potent, like that's something that everyone in that room is going to remember, because it really
it's a moment. Without question.
It's a moment, and I think that's the type of serendipity that you can't, I'm not going to lie to you and say it's guaranteed to happen every single time, but when you do the work to give that moment the best chance of happening, it could happen. And it's incredible, right? To me, that's so much more valuable than an Instagram, because it's meaningful. You've impacted someone's life. They're going to go out and talk about that in the world.
I think that story is great for a lot of reasons, because what you're saying about like how meaningful it is, essentially by putting in the work, I think what sort of happens is, by understanding the audience, understanding why they're there, understanding maybe a little bit what they're looking for, what their challenges are, by understanding all that, and then putting together this event, you are giving yourselves a way better chance for somebody like that guy to feel comfortable, to feel belong. He feels the sense of belonging, like we talked about earlier, to stand up and say what he said. And then for someone else to say, hey, that's community, that's belonging. And I think you were able to help create, or in the right direction, push that moment to happening by giving people a space where they feel comfortable, they feel some community, it feels authentic. There's just so much there that kind of vibes and blends all together to just, make that happen, to make that experience, go.
It comes down to like the basics, right? It's like people just want to feel seen, heard, and understood. I think when you can create that environment, it gives way to moments like this. It doesn't have to be pretty, although, it should be, right? It doesn't, the sort of approach to experiential is being, how do I create this space that people are going to want to share and talk about, I think should be secondary to how do I want to make someone feel being in the space? What do I want them to remember? What do I want them to take away? How do I want to impact them in a way that's unforgettable?
I like that a lot.
The rest of it is important, but it kind of unravels itself at that point.
Nice. That's a great story, man. I really love that. I feel like that sort of brings everything and ties everything together of what we've kind of been talking about, from research, knowing the audience, right? Trying to create a sense of belonging, understanding what ties people together, right? And then creating a moment that kind of blends all that together. I have a bit of a closing thing I like to do on the podcast with people that are in your shoes, people that, you're a founder of a company, which is really cool. We also talk to a lot of event marketers and people that are way further up in their career than maybe some others are. So what I typically like to ask is, what is advice that you would give to your younger self? Say 10 years, say 8 years, 7 years, but just advice you'd give to your younger self.
It's a great question. I think keep being curious, keep being relentlessly curious. I think when you stop asking questions and you stop wanting to go down rabbit holes, your mind begins to atrophy, right? You get stuck. Curiosity leads to discovery. You're gonna find out things about yourself, about other people, things that wouldn't necessarily occur in sort of the we live in bubbles, in the bubble that you're in. I think it's so important to just want to know what is happening in other bubbles. I think it adds so much nuance and context, in the way that we deal with people, in the way that we understand people. And it gives you a perspective, right? Like, again, coming back to that idea that like not having a point of view is just, it's boring.
It is boring. Yeah.
I would say, relentless
Keep being
curiosity.
curious. I love that answer,
Yeah.
man. And I find the more that I ask people these questions, I had somebody I thought had a good one kind of similar, and they talked about being flexible. A lot of younger people, when they get in their careers, they don't understand how flexible they need to be, and how flexibility will take you places and teach you things you thought you'd never learn. Right. And it's interesting. A lot of people's answers are very much in line, even as you get older, but like keep being curious is something that you could tell anybody. Right? Like that concept of being curious, asking questions, being open-minded, trying to put yourself in other people's shoes, or just wondering and going down that rabbit hole a little bit. That is very, very good advice, man.
Thanks.
Camille, this was fun. You are a
Thank you so
wealth
much,
of knowledge. Yes, you're a wealth of knowledge on the experiential side. I like the way you I like the way you think about it. I really do like engineering serendipity. It's a very cool saying, cool phrase. Thank you for being on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you, Matt. Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
You got it, buddy. You did great. Some really awesome answers there. And thank you everybody for listening. This is Event Marketing Redefined. I'm your host, Matt Kleinrock, CEO of Rockway Exhibits and Events. And we appreciate you listening. We'll catch you next time. Thank you so much.